Okay, so the theme today is provisionality. So last time, if you remember, 2 weeks ago, we discussed scepticism. Scepticism in the basic sense of the recognition of uncertainty. Now we're in a similar situation to last time in that there is a basic video, like a 10-minute, in fact I think it's only 8-minute video, which gives you an introduction to that topic. So I'm going to kind of assume that you've either watched that or we're going to at some stage, so that will give you some basics on the topic, particularly from a very immediate practical standpoint. You know, just what is it? What does it involve to do it? I'm going to try and give it a slightly big context now, just as I did last week with scepticism. So, yeah, provisionality is a surprisingly uncommonly used word. You know, when I first started using it, which was probably 10 years ago now, or more than that probably, certainly then I found that word, Microsoft Word didn't recognize it, put a little squiggly red line under it. So, you know, it's really not that often used. If you search it on the internet, you'll probably find Middle Way Society stuff, I imagine. Obviously the term provisional is widely used, but provisionality as an abstract term is not. So it's the quality of being able to change your judgments. As the video explains in more detail, it basically has two components. There's being aware of uncertainty or skepticism, and there's the being able to engage with other options or optionality that I think are necessary to provisionality. Okay, but now I'm going to try and give it a slightly bigger context. First of all, by talking about needs, actually. So it may not seem an obvious starting point immediately, but you'll see how it's relevant in a minute. So I'm just going to share a little diagram, which may be familiar to some of you. So this is a nice diagram of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So developed, I think, quite a long time ago now by Maslow, psychologist. It's a really useful analysis, I think, of the sorts of things humans need, starting with the most basic at the bottom, which, you know, the conditions of survival, and working up to what he calls self-actualization. So the more complex needs that we have as specifically as humans. And on the way, we need safety and belonging and self-esteem. So if we think in terms of those needs, then whatever we do, well, these needs are going to basically motivate us, yeah? So our beliefs are very much going to be geared towards you know, fulfilling those needs. Those needs are going to shape our beliefs and our values and our responses to things. So they've got a lot to do with how we judge things, which is what the middle way is all about. Okay, so to come back to provisionality in a minute, we have a range of needs that we need to fulfill, and these needs are fulfilled in habitual ways in a particular environment where we find ourselves. So we develop particular sorts of beliefs about how to fulfill those needs and about the world in general. So we tend to focus on the things that will help us to fulfill our needs, whatever they are. So for example, for early humans, if you were hunting deer, then you would develop beliefs about the habits of deer and where they would be found and so on. So that sets a pattern of judgment. And we often start to then, to make those patterns of judgment more efficient, we automatize them or we make them absolute. So we go snap straight into that way of judging without having to consider it or put it in a bigger context. As the saying goes, we don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time. So we have these more efficient ways of operating in the environments we're used to that help to meet our needs. And that, of course, can be the source of absolutized beliefs. We get used to believing a certain thing that helps us to meet our needs in a particular environment. But of course, environments change. Probably don't need to tell you that, and there's lots of discussion about climate change as a big change, which is likely to impact on us and is already impacting on us. But of course, there's lots of other kinds of change as well: social change, intellectual change, and indeed psychological individual change. So if we carry on with the old beliefs, when the environment changes, then we're likely to become maladapted, in the sense that we can no longer fulfill our needs, or no longer fulfill them so well in that new environment if we carry on with the same old ways of doing things and the same assumptions. And those assumptions may be very basic. They matter the whole way we frame the way we think. Now that's fairly obvious in an evolutionary perspective. So there's one parable story I wrote in a book called Parables of the Middle Way, which is about comparison between the panda and the rat. The rat is highly adaptable, but the panda is not. So the wrong sort of bamboo, sorry, if the right sort of bamboo dies out, then the panda may die out as well, but the rat will just get a new food source. So that's a very simple sort of evolutionary example of adaptation and flexibility, that the rat's flexible, so the rat survives. And that's basically what we need to do, not just to survive, but more generally to fulfill our needs, and indeed going all the way up that hierarchy of needs, so to meet our most subtle and refined needs as well as our most basic ones, we have to adapt and be able to adapt to new circumstances. So the quality that we need to be able to adapt is provisionality, and provisionality is a quality thus that can be contrasted with absolutization. So with absolutization, you've got a fixed set of beliefs you apply to your judgments, and you assume that those beliefs are true. So they're not going to be shifted by new information. You're not open to new information to shift them. So provisionality allows us to adapt to new circumstances. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I think that requires two sorts of qualities working together. So on the one hand, we need to understand the limitations. At some level, we need to understand the limitations of our current way of doing things. So that's where scepticism that I discussed last week comes in. Without that scepticism, we might just continue in the same old framework, not questioning it at all. But skepticism by itself doesn't necessarily get you to adapt in the way that's appropriate for a new situation. So you also need awareness of alternatives, of different kinds of possible beliefs that you might have. And that's where I take the term optionality, which comes from Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He uses this term, he talks about options, different ways that we can possibly think about things, or different ways we could act as well. So the options that we have are created by really what occurs to us. Obviously, there's what we allow ourselves to think. Yeah. So if we're stuck because of a high level of stress, we're stuck in an absolute way of thinking in which there's only the belief that we're in and a threatening alternative negative to it. Yeah, that's absolutization. But when we introduce more options, well, there could be any number of other options that we might consider. Those have got to be neither yes nor no in relation to the beliefs, the fixed beliefs we might have had before. Yeah, so in some ways they're going to be in a different frame, a different way of thinking. Just give you a simple example of that, actually, from my own experience just today. So I was discussing with my wife about the ethics of using Amazon. And I have just occasionally been ordering books from Amazon, I have to confess. And she reminded me about the horrendous employment practices in Amazon, and also the lack of payment of taxes from Amazon. And yeah, I hadn't fully considered the way in which that might alter my book buying habits. So although there are some ways I still have to relate to Amazon, I have to sell books through them because it's largely the only way of selling books. I do have options when it comes to buying them. So yeah, I have options. I became aware of options, but I wouldn't have had those options if they hadn't become vivid enough to me to actually take those options. So otherwise I might have stayed in an automatic process of believing and acting in the same way on that area of moral decision making. Okay, and very often the whole way in which people habitually frame their beliefs will only present two options or two sets of assumptions, and that's often the case in the general area of philosophy and religion, for example, where you get these entrenched dualisms, sort of theism and atheism, and free will and determinism, and realism and idealism, and so on. Yeah, you have to go into quite a long argument with people very often to just get them to consider there might be a third alternative for any of those entrenched dualisms. So, because that's about the whole way we have framed that debate. And those dualisms can then, unreflectingly become part of our whole way of thinking about a situation, particularly free will and determinism, which is a very practical thing. Can you take responsibility in this situation or not? So how do we become more aware of other ways of thinking? The role of the arts and the imagination is crucial here. So the arts and the imagination give us access to other possible ways of thinking. So do other things that bring us basically into contact with new sources of meaning, new symbols that we might be able to relate to our experience. So studying almost anything new, learning new languages, traveling, very often those things, just at the brain level, they make new synaptic connections, and those enable us, they give us more options. They enable us to think in different possible ways. Of course, it also depends on our mental states, whether we're able to make use of all those possible connections. So mindfulness also comes into it. Are we aware enough of those options at that moment to be able to choose them? So there are different levels of practice that come into play here altogether. Critical thinking makes us aware of the limitations of our other views. The arts can make more options available to us, and mindfulness can help us, also help to make more options available to us, because our brains are in a state that's able to access them. So that's what I mean by meaning. So in a future talk, probably a couple of months down the line now, I'll be talking about the integration of meaning. So I'll talk more about meaning, but basically we're talking about meaning as related to our bodies, and particularly according to the embodied meaning thesis of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. So meaning is something we really can't have too much of. It can proliferate. The more meaning we have, the more live options we might have. So meaning needs to be, I think, clearly distinguished from belief. Belief needs rigorous scrutiny. We need to be able to reflect on whether our beliefs are justified or not in the circumstances. That's where scepticism comes in. But for provisionality, we need more than just scepticism. We need to be able to access a greater range of meaning. Okay, I'll leave it there for now and open to questions. So you could do the hand raising, which is on the participants tab, or you can just unmute yourself and speak. If you've got any thoughts, could be a comment, as well as a question, could be a reaction.
Hi, Robert. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, it's Jim. So I don't know, have you got that picture, the two mules picture to hand?
Yes. Yeah.
Because so while you're finding it, I'll just say a bit more about it. As when I first came across this in the context of middle way society, there's a stage in this sort of sequence of events of the two mules going from pulling in opposite directions, trying to get their own supply of food from different places, but they're tied together with a rope. You'll see it when the picture comes in a moment. I think Robert showed it a few weeks ago. And I at the time, what bothered me was the fact that they go from pulling against each other, and then there's a moment where there it is. So the second thing down there and third thing, they're pulling against each other, and then there's this there's this point where they stop pulling, and you can see that that's the fourth one down, where they're sort of sitting there doing nothing. I imagine them talking to each other. But so something had to happen for them for them to stop with their sort of fruitless pulling in each direction and that's where the optionality comes in. So it's a comment. It's not a question. Sorry, this is a comment. It's just it was at the time. It's almost like, I wanted to know what was the formula for this to happen, and the point is that there isn't a formula for this to happen. It's more about developing the habit of and opening yourself up to the other options and allowing those things in order for you to go from this sort of pulling in different directions thing to considering that there might be a more appropriate way of dealing with the situation.
Yeah, I mean, the two mules, I'm planning to talk about more, and it comes up also in the video I've already got on integration. So it's a little way down the line. But yeah, actually, you can talk about this in relation to all the other principles as well.
Yeah, if it comes up. Oh, it can come up quite frequently, can't it? But it's just that it bothered me that ideally this is what you'd want to happen, but something has to happen halfway down the sort of the sequence here, for a change for the better to occur. And it's not that this can happen magically or that even that you can program it in somehow. It's this quality of provisionality and being open to sort of growing your other options that makes that possible. And so anyway, that's like a sort of an insight I've had.
Great. Okay, thanks for that, Jim.
Over the time of seeing this again and again. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, you could also put scepticism in that sequence, actually. So the third picture, I think, is where the mules become skeptical in the sense that they become less certain, or they become uncertain about their assumptions.
The assumption being that they, in the story, that they need to just pull as hard as they can until they get that. They get that food. Yeah.
Quite. Yeah. And then the provisionality, I think the fourth picture is that more because they're considering, they're thinking about new other options.
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, I think Robin. You there, Robin?
My question is with
having problems with the sound, I'm afraid. You sound like a Dalek.
Can you hear me now?
No, sorry, can't hear you properly.
Action.
You could type it in the chat. If you've got a question. I'll leave Robin to type that, but anyone else got any questions in the meantime?
I was looking at that picture and thinking, change, what Jim said, it very much assumes that donkey does, there's equality, that both donkeys have the same amount of power. And I'm just wondering if it's got something to do, or in what way is sort of education, for example, with children today so different to the way I received my education, from seriously top down, where I wouldn't have got any food because I would have been pulled over to the teacher's bail. And particularly in Britain, looking at how optionality is so changed for children today, or I mean, Jim could speak to that because he's a teacher, but I was just curious about it. I look at my grandchildren, I think they've got so many more options than I was ever given. I don't think I was ever even asked a question as a child, except to get the answer right.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to distinguish options here in the social sense from options in the psychological sense. So socially, you can give somebody options, like, you know, they can choose their course at school or something, or at college, but the options that one actually considers are the psychological options, as it were. In order to consider a course in archaeology, for example, the student will have to be able to engage with the idea of studying archaeology, not just have it on the list. And that's possibly one of the issues with capitalism, as I would see it, that it often presents us with options that are sort of there socially, but they're not really there psychologically. You know, you could have 20 brands of coffee, but actually they don't make much difference. You don't have a particular reason for choosing one rather than the other, so the choice is not a real choice. It's not a psychologically experienced choice.
I find it very interesting that diagram of the mules is often seen on a poster on the outside of Quaker meeting houses. And not all issues there are engaged in a form of sort of provisionality, that particularly in areas, for example, like Quaker Pacifism, where you've taken one particular, I mean, the classic example of that would have been Pennsylvania, or one of the Quaker states in America, confronted with the fact that they had citizens, residents, who were not pacifists. To the point, you probably know that warships, when they were short of a gun or two on the side, put out something made of wood, which became known as a Quaker, because it never fired. And so, you know, not all situations end up in a sort of, the Quakers never really in that position changed their view on the situation, you know, whether the Native Americans were attacking you or whatever. The balance there never quite changed.
Yeah, okay. Perhaps I should come to Robin's question, which he typed in the chat. So he asks, how do you link the arts with the opening up of new ways of thinking? Well, basically, it's the through the arts, whether we're creating them or whether we're appreciating them, we are coming into contact with new meaning of one kind or another, where both in a cognitive and emotional and both sense. Yeah. So, for example, last night I watched a Shakespeare play, a video of it, Henry IV Part 2. So that helped me encounter new characters. So I got a deeper appreciation of the character of Falstaff. Yeah, so that's a sort of sense of a possible character that one could be or that one could relate to. There were also possibly new words or new ways of expressing things that I came into contact with. And of course, the dramatic aspects of that. So the way in which the whole thing was presented, the visuals, the layout, and so on, impressions of Shakespearean buildings or whatever. So there's new, well, you could generally call them ideas there, but ideas might consist of new words, they might consist of new possible beliefs. You know, they could be fully framed in that sense. They're the building blocks of new ways of thinking. So things that can contribute to new ways of thinking. Whether that's through the visual imagination or the auditory imagination or the verbal imagination, depending on which set of arts you're thinking of, the visual or the musical or the literary. So, don't know, does that make sense, Robin? Do you want to just signal your thinking, or you could type it if you can't speak it? I think Robin's frozen, actually. They may not even have heard that. Anyway, never mind. Anyone else got any questions or thoughts?
Yeah.
James.
I was wondering, I was thinking in relation to the sort of corona. I was due to watch some cricket this weekend. I was really excited about it. And then there was an announcement on Friday, which meant I couldn't go. And I was really pissed off. And I was thinking that there's a lot of provisionality around the coronavirus kind of rules and expectations of what you can and can't do with life, and how that some of that interferes with whatever needs you might have that perhaps sometimes can't be met. And I was just wondering whether do we dislike provisionality in a way, that we'd rather know for definite that something's going to happen and that we can do it, and we like certainty, and that the very notion of provisionality in terms of having to think a bit more about things is actually something that sometimes, yes, if you're very curious and inquiring, it's what you want to do, but some of the time it's just a pain, isn't it? And we'd rather not have it.
Sure, well, shortcuts are easier, yeah. And
Yeah.
they're more efficient. In terms of energy, you know, you use less glucose in your brain when you don't think through new options. Yeah, so that's tempting. Yeah, and so there's going to be more more effort involved in being provisional. So yeah, it's a question of motivating ourselves to that effort.
Well, it's the adaptation as well, I suppose, that it suggests that there's a need for greater adaptation in these times in terms of having to change routines and patterns and things you'd normally do automatically. And the adaptation is quite hard work. Indeed,
yeah. But of course, you can make it easier by practice.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's a good thing to encourage the development of adaptability, if you like. And so sometimes a challenging situation can be useful in terms of helping you develop that capacity to be adaptive.
Yeah, quite.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a lot of what education is about for me as a teacher, and whether it's about making it easier for students to think, in a sense, giving them practice.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Just have a couple of reflections on basically what Jim and Bridget and James have just said. I mean, when I first came across that the two mules, I was similar to Jim in, you know, so it all makes sense, but how do you get past stage 4? But I mean, it's what I've learned from perhaps being a member here for many years is that provisionality is very much a sensibility that you try to that you create, you know, through the various practices, the integrative practices you've spoken about, Robert, like, you know, mindfulness or engagements in the arts, and you know that you know, in modernity, just to answer Bridget's question, is that, you know, in many ways we do have more options, but in some ways we're also more limited. I'm thinking about social media, that, you know, it's so easy to get into this sort of echo chamber of all the you know, the media we read, etc. And so cultivating that provisionality enables you to actually seek other sources of information, and also to James's point that, you know, yeah, we do have an itch for certainty, and it is easier, but that another aspect of you know, why we're here in a sense is that, you know, we're talking about, rather than thinking in absolute terms, always going back to our experience. And if you have a practice of doing this regularly, of being provisional, then you will see that, you know, in the long run, that your decision making is actually tends to be more effective when you actually consider alternatives more. Yeah, but it's big picture stuff, isn't it? You know, and again, that's part of that sensibility that we're trying to cultivate.
Yeah, yeah, and obviously you can't make the time out of nowhere to make decisions, but you can use more of the time that you already have, which is a point I made last time, I think. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're about out of our usual time there, so I will stop recording.